Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Sunday, August the 17th, 2025. Last month we did a very interesting show with my old friend Soli Ozel, one of Turkey's leading intellectuals, on what we called the revolting elites, on Christopher Lasch, the American sociologist, political theorist, on how he predicted Trump and the crisis of American democracy. Soli wrote a piece, very interesting piece, in the Ideas Letter called Lashing Out. Lasch has become an increasingly visible figure, even if he's no longer around, particularly his 1995 classic, The Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy. And the show got a lot of response, including from our old friend, another regular on the show, David Masciotra, who was last on the show talking about why he still believes in the American dream. Masciotra is interested in Lasch, some ways sympathetic and in some ways not. So I thought it would be a good idea to have both David and Soli on the show to talk a little bit more about Lasch and the challenges and opportunities for progressives in our populist Trumpian age. So welcome both Soli and David. Great to have you both on the show. David, perhaps we might begin with you in terms of your response to my conversation or our conversation with Soli back in July on Christopher Lasch.
Yeah, and it's my pleasure to do this. Thank you to yourself, our gracious host, and thank you, Soli, for enduring my rants, as it were. So
it wasn't rants for me.
What's that?
It was not rants for me.
Oh, okay, thank you.
It was welcome.
Yeah, if it was a rant, you wouldn't have been invited on. It was an erudite response.
Oh, yeah. All right. Well, thank you. So Christopher Lasch, I became very interested in Lasch as a graduate student, and when I wrote a book about John Mellencamp, the singer-songwriter in the protest tradition from my home state of Indiana. And even though Lasch was a professor and a writer and John Mellencamp a rock and roll singer-songwriter, I could identify many similarities. The celebration of agrarian communities, the celebration of families as a bulwark against encroaching corporate capitalism, encroaching commercialization, attended by political corruption, and also a sense of distress with the American left for its inadequate response to these problems. The one Lasch line that I'm particularly fond of quoting, or at least paraphrasing, is that at a certain point, the American left gave up on solving the big problems. So it became hyper-focused on these tiny problems that its various leaders and foot soldiers felt they could control. Where I part from Soli is I think that Lasch was so suspicious of progress, and some of that suspicion was justified. To quote another songwriter, they paved paradise and put up a parking lot. Not everything just because it's labeled, yes, not everything just because it's labeled progress is worthy of celebration. But Lasch's suspicion takes us to an extent where he becomes nostalgic for a romanticized past that never existed. And in my assessment of his work, leaves us with a curious absence of a willingness to engage with the very movements that were attempting to make America more egalitarian. So he was highly critical and bitter towards feminism. He was suspicious and often dismissive of gay rights. And although he was a supporter of the civil rights movement, he never engaged with it substantively in his writing. So that leaves us with this gaping hole. And it also leaves us to conclude that Lasch's vision is one of a romanticized past on a homestead with a nuclear family that fails to live up to historical scrutiny, because the homestead family life was not as good as many conservatives imagine, and Lasch was not a conservative, and also leaves us with empty hands and empty hearts when we try to consider how we reconcile and reckon with the future. So Lasch was predictive of Trump, I would say, as a forebearer to the excuse making that often exists on the behalf of Trump supporters, that this is some manifestation of working class rage and desperation, whereas those who take that line are not giving necessary attention to the pathologies within American society, and particularly on the right side of the American political ledger that gave birth to Trump.
Let me before I get to Soli's response, let me just ask you one thing, David. You're very well versed in the cultural politics of American history. The tradition that you're critical of Lasch is a long one in America. He certainly didn't begin it. I mean, go back to Jefferson, certainly to Thoreau and Emerson, Henry Truslow Adams, who invented the concept of the American dream in the 1930s. Many American, quote unquote, progressives have that kind of Rousseauian nostalgia for American innocence, don't they?
Yes, and in fact, Soli probably knows much more about this than I do, but I believe Lasch came to have profound admiration for Emerson after being critical of Emerson. I think he declared Emerson as the most important American writer in the history of the country, or some superlative like that. So yes, there is a long tradition of a progressivism, ironically enough, that romanticizes and idealizes some kind of untamed past. But that's not the type of progressivism that has continually led to socio-political improvements that have made this country more democratic, more fair, more free, more equal.
Okay, so you've given us a good beginning to this. Soli, you're an admirer of Lasch, although, as David says, he is also in some ways an admirer of Lasch. Is his core critique, is it fair? Is it accurate?
I think David has a point, and I think I at least touch on some of those in my article and in the conversation I had with you. That is, I believe Lasch is correct about the responsibility of the elites in the deterioration of liberal democratic order within the United States, but he has a rather romantic view of what the counter elites, or those who are not part of the elites, would actually offer the country in terms of a democratic system, tolerance, or principles of living together. And that we touched upon when you and I spoke about my article. And that is the weakness of Lasch. I mean, he does talk about Martin Luther King as an exemplary leader, but it's true that he doesn't really talk about the civil rights movement, or he does not analyze the civil rights movement properly in the context of American history. And in a way, I guess when we look back, the civil rights movement, what my generation certainly from abroad even thought was taking the United States in the right direction, has also put the seeds of the reaction that we're seeing today. In the work of David's that I have the pleasure to read, truly pleasure to read, you see how that egalitarian principle, that is racial equality, gender equality, and all that stuff, at some point, for a whole variety of reasons, not essential things perhaps, does backfire. It does backfire. Whether it is the problem or the responsibility of those who push those things, or the way they push those things, or is it really the innate characteristics of those who are angry about losing power, is, I think, the core of the debate. I think it has elements of both.
So what do you mean, Soli? Let me ask her one question, because what do you mean backfire?
Well, you ask for busing as a liberal, and then people point out that your children go to private schools.
So this is in the context of the elites critique.
Yeah, exactly. And in a way, you are imposing, for idealistically very good reasons, a way of living their lives to people who are not necessarily open to it or are welcoming it. Now, I'm not saying that they are right in rejecting it. That is a fundamental conflict in the way people fight about how they're going to be living their lives. And I'm not sure that this is an easy question or is an easy problem to resolve either. Okay? I mean, are we going to say, well, if you're a white racist and you don't really want to consider the blacks as your equals, you are entitled or you are right to have your own way of life, and then reject them becoming more equal to you as citizens? Okay? That's not necessary. That's not what I would want a society to be consisting of. Okay? This is not my conception of citizenship. But it is undoubtedly true that politically, after four or five decades, it is part of the reaction to the liberal order that from the 50s and 60s onwards had been the setting the standards for how the Americans ought to live their lives, the principles or the values that they should live their lives with or by.
So let me just, before I get to David, let me just clarify one thing, because I have to admit I'm slightly confused. David's critical of Lasch because he doesn't pay enough attention and he's rather dismissive of feminism, civil rights.
No, he finds.
Let me just finish this question. Okay. Are you suggesting that in Lasch's critique of the American elites, that's somehow structurally unavoidable? I mean, after all, Lasch could have just come back if we had him from the grave. He could say, yeah, I did care about women and civil rights. I just didn't talk about them that much, but actually that I care about that. But are you saying, Soli, that within the logic of Lasch's argument, there's almost a requirement for him to be ambivalent or silent or sometimes even critical of women's rights or civil rights?
I think he is, I cannot say, based on what I have read, that he is necessarily against something like equal rights for women, okay? On the other hand, he thinks to try to impose this and to ask everyone to actually partake of your way of living your life was something that he was not comfortable with. He thought this was an imposition and that it would immediately bring a reaction as well. He should have written more, but he should have written more about the problems that he saw in the classes for which he wanted to be a spokesperson, whose rights he wanted to defend. Remember, he said, oh, well, those guys may be a bit xenophobic, a bit racist about this and a bit that and all those negative things. But at the end of the day, and I think David mentions this in one of his articles, they are the holders of civic virtue. And what we're seeing is, and I think this is David's critique, please correct me if I'm wrong, David, no, they are not interested in civic virtue.
So, yeah,
okay?
So that's a
so
good
there
response.
There is a miscommunication there.
Right, but we're more interested in structural issues than miscommunications.
Okay.
And to be fair to Lasch, let's be clear. I mean, he died pretty young at 62. It's quite conceivable 62. That he could have lived another 20 years and written all sorts of books. So back to you, David, on this. Maybe I'm being a little academic here, but this question of whether Lasch's cultural critique of elites required an ambivalence or perhaps even criticism of feminism or civil rights. Is that an important issue for progressive? Because the three of us are all progressives and everyone's trying to figure out a progressive response to Trumpism. That's why we're having this conversation.
Well, I think if we look at I think Soli was very helpful in framing the way we're having this conversation around civil rights and race, and he used the unfortunate example of busing because that was a poor policy in its execution and also in its the way it was sold to people. But if we go back and look at something even more fundamental than that, part of this backlash or backfire that Soli identifies is the entrance of white evangelical Christians into American politics as an influential force within the Republican Party, and now in some ways the most dominant force, because they are the most loyal and voluminous constituency within the Trump base. Contrary to popular belief, the religious right did not enter into politics to oppose abortion or feminism or gay rights. It was to defend segregation in schools, because they were running schools in the South that refused to admit any students who were not white. And President Carter, who they supported because of his personal piety, and who they believed was an ally, being this Christian evangelical from Georgia, sent the Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Education against those schools and made them either reform or shut down. So the religious right entered into American politics. So that's a major development in not only American politics, but Republican politics, and the eventual triumph of Trump that Lasch does not contend with. And I suspect, I hate to try to, we'll keep it to the work rather than reading the mind of Lasch. Lasch acknowledged that working class Americans were often given to provincialism, racism, and sexism, but he still romanticized them as the sources of civic virtue in our society. And that's where Lasch makes a big mistake. It's much more clarifying to analyze American politics through one of Lasch's contemporaries, with whose work he contended, Richard Hofstadter, and understand that American politics is shot through with anti-intellectualism and paranoia. And there's a contradiction here, because Lasch's best-selling book, which makes a brilliant argument, is The Culture of Narcissism. And because of the culture of narcissism, Jimmy Carter, as president, sought Lasch's advice and counsel for how to speak to the public. He did the same with the subject of one of my books, Jesse Jackson. Jackson and Lasch and others were part of a group that Carter's advisors referred to with contempt as the God Squad. And Carter's speech, Crisis of Confidence, comes out of the meeting with the God Squad, in which he criticizes the American people for their consumerism and self-involvement. But Lasch often exonerates the working class from that critique, which I think sets up a dysfunctional and inherently contradictory analysis of American politics, and helps to explain why Trump supporters are never called to account in our public discourse.
Sorry, I mean, isn't what David's saying reason for the Trump supporters not to vote for the Democrats? Because the Democrats are always accusing these working class Americans of being racist or sexist and trying to interfere in their lives.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, and it also has a name now, right? Wokeism, which had gone too far, and it has been very intolerant. But if I can go back to what David said, I think Lasch's problem with the concept of progress, or our belief in progress, was fundamental to his critique. That's number one. And number two, he took religion far more seriously than most of the progressive secular intellectuals or liberals did. And the thing is, what we're seeing is religion per se, as well as religion organized politically, were not to be dismissed as easily, because nothing else replaced what religion provided for those believers. And not just as believers, as individual believers, but also as a political force. And in that sense, maybe, and I think he's actually dwelled on it quite extensively to a certain extent. And that is the part of the Lasch work that maybe we have to revisit and then reconsider. The real problem, the problem that I see, and I just mentioned this before we started this conversation. I mean, the latest Thomas Ozel piece is about a town on the Arkansas-Texas
This is
border.
Thomas Etzel's been on the show, New York Times, right?
Yeah. In which the Biden administration invested heavily for alternative energy and all that. And the town's unemployment rate went down. The town became more prosperous because this is where renewable energy industry was actually developing. And at the end of the 4 years, they voted 75% for Trump rather than Biden's vice president, Kamala Harris. And I think we always find ourselves in that quandary. David also already mentioned the receiverism or deliverism, I'm sorry. That is, if you provide the population with the material goods that they need in order to get on with their lives, is that enough? And now you do that, and then they go against your grain, they go against your principles, and they vote for someone like Trump, who, for us, obviously is not going to be a protector of their interests. Not only of their material interests, but probably of their moral interests either. So the quandary for someone like me, anyway, why do they do that?
And I don't want to. I want to get away a little bit from Lasch, because this is not a seminar on Lasch, but the issues are so important. I mean, to me, some of the inheritors of Laschian ideas are theorists like Thomas Frank, who of course wrote about Kansas, and Michael Lind, who's actually coming on the show next week, David. So rather than just focusing on Lasch, this is a quandary for progressives, isn't it?
Andrew, can I say one thing about Lind? Because I admire Lind's book. When Obama won, I think in 2012, Lind wrote a piece and said, the South has lost. Come 2024, the South doesn't look like it has lost.
Lost what?
The ideological and the political battle.
You mean the white South?
Yeah. Confederate South. It doesn't look like that today.
Well, I'll get him on the show. He's coming on the show next week. I'll ask him about it.
You can ask that question, yeah.
But in a broad sense, David, you're a man of the left, unambiguously. There is a debate now amongst the Lins and the Franks of the world versus a different kind of progressivism, isn't there? Which is why you feel so passionately about Lasch, who is one of the founders, I guess, of this debate on the left.
Well, yes, and Frank, I'm more familiar with Frank's work than Lynn's, but Frank falls into the trap. He entertains this delusion that the reason people are voting for Trump is because Democrats have failed to do X, Y, and Z. See, people like
liberal.
Yes, people like Frank, I believe, engage in a coping mechanism that they don't want to believe that 1/3 of the American public, half of those who bother to show up at the polls, are essentially authoritarian in their philosophy, that they applaud, they cheerlead when Trump deports otherwise law-abiding, undocumented immigrants to get tortured in El Salvador, that they applaud when Trump violates the human rights of student protesters and undocumented workers. They applaud when Trump initiates a Maoist attack on entire sectors of society that they've identified as the enemy. And they applaud because they're motivated by, as Hofstadter would have understood, prejudice and paranoia. They feel that the United States of America always was and should remain a white patriarchal society.
And Christian.
And yes, and Christian. And I mean, Pete Hegseth's pastor was on CNN just a few days ago identifying as a Christian nationalist. And therefore, the critics like Frank, they search for some economic explanation, economic anxiety, because that would make these voters more rational, more democratic, and perhaps more amenable to persuasion. But all of the evidence contradicts that rose-colored glasses view, some of which Soli just referenced. I would add an even more major example of the Affordable Care Act. I mean, President Obama gave 20 to 30 million people health insurance for the first time, including many poor rural whites in states like Indiana and North Carolina and South Carolina,
West Virginia.
And West Virginia. And the thanks that he received was the Tea Party movement. And eventually the nomination to the presidency of a man, Donald Trump, who spearheaded birtherism in American politics.
So I take your point. So Soli, the argument that David's making, it kind of reminds me of the new left of the 60s, this moral virtuousness. You and I were grad students at Berkeley. We're all too familiar with that. You feel good about yourself. You feel good about your own morality, and you continue to lose elections. You continue to alienate Americans. Hillary Clinton famously describing the people David doesn't like as, what were they, undesirables or degenerates?
No, deplorables.
Deplorables. So is there a problem with what David is saying? I mean, we're not going to, you and I, we're not in any way sympathetic to racists or sexists, but is this attempt to seize the moral high ground ultimately politically disastrous? Don't we have to recognize that Trump and populism, not just in the US, but around the world, you're in Turkey, you're perhaps more familiar with what's happening on that front than us, that the progressives, the left, have to respond rather than just clinging to their own moral virtue?
I think self-righteousness is not a good starting point for good political work if you want electoral support. And that, I think, was a main idea of Lasch's as well. That is, I think he was very critical of the self-righteousness of the elites who scorned upon or condescended those who did not share their values, their principles, the way they look at the world. But there is something in David's work which I think you should bring to our conversation, and that is something that I noticed in 2016 as well. It's not just those white, working class, less educated guys who have voted for Trump. A lot of the people who had more income than the average income of Americans have voted for Trump in what he calls exurbia. And that still continues to be the case.
Yeah, and David has a wonderful new book out on exurbia.
Exactly. And so it behooves us to actually try to explain why comfortably adopted to global economy or to cosmopolitan economy, such as people who live in exurbia, whose per capita income is higher than the average.
But hold on, wait. But David's version of exurbia is of the poorer version of suburbia. I mean, if you don't have a lot of money...
No, that's not true.
That's not true, Andrew. The exurbia that I write about is the exurbia that the Wall Street Journal identified as having much more per capita income than the rest.
Okay, sorry, my mistake.
And these are strongholds of Trump support, and they also consistently elect the most radically right-wing representatives to Congress. So, like Marjorie Taylor Greene's district in Georgia is heavily exurban. Lauren Boebert in Colorado, heavily exurban. Jim Jordan in Ohio, predominantly exurban. And this is something that, it's the subject of my book because I live close to exurbia, so it was a good topic for me to write about. But as Soli is pointing out, and I really appreciate his generosity of doing so, it complicates this conversation because many people want to act as if the typical Trump voter is a reincarnation of the Jode family, where in reality, there's much more economic diversity among Trump support, and some of his most loyal and rabid supporters, including a majority of those who participated in the January 6th insurrection, are middle to upper middle class. They're above the median income range of the American public. They tend to be what Marx would have identified as the petit bourgeois, shopkeepers, tradesmen, small business owners who are making, 70 to 90 grand per year, which isn't elite wealth, but at the same time, it's also not struggling hand to mouth.
So does that mean, let me just ask this, because I take your point, but should we be more contemptuous of white people who earn $90,000 who are racist than those who only own $40,000 or $50,000?
But see, Andrew, I don't want to relitigate the Hillary Clinton deplorable remark, but my response would be there's this double standard here. And I have a larger point I'm going to make. Hillary Clinton says deplorable, and in the past 9 years since she has said it, we've acted like it was the equivalent of 9/11. Now, I agree that it was an impolitic remark and that anyone running for office shouldn't insult voters. Mitt Romney learned that lesson as well with his 47% comment. But this is a standard to which we never hold the Trump right.
Yeah.
I mean, Trump continually insults immigrants. They're poisoning the blood of the country. He insults liberals and Democrats, calling them freaks and perverts and traitors. He insults entire cities and states of the country, California, Chicago, and no one panics about this. And I would submit that's because we're living in a country that still operates according to the discourse framework that Nell Painter and Michael Eric Dyson and other Black writers have identified as that which is white is seen as universal and normal, and that which is anything else is seen as particular and abnormal. So when Hillary Clinton says deplorables, it's the equivalent of a national catastrophe.
Okay, so I take your point, but you're still losing elections. Soli, come
Well,
back
but
to
it's
you.
not my job to win elections. I'm not a pollster.
It is your job in the sense that you want to make America a better place, and it's certainly not a better place under Trump. Soli.
Yes. Look, in all of that discussion, we leave out a very, very important factor, and that is, where do the big corporations actually situate themselves? No? I mean, particularly in 2024, big capital of Silicon Valley, big capital of Wall Street, which after 6th of January promised that they would never give a penny to Trump, who have then spent billions of millions of dollars helping him or helping his campaign and stuff. So the choices of corporate capital is also as important in determining where the funds are that can actually manipulate or at least shape the vision of the public in a country where most people don't go to the polls to vote. I mean, you have in one of your articles, David, if you don't go to vote, you basically, I mean, your choice is either to go to vote or not to go to vote, that is. And if you don't go to vote, then you basically give the others 2 votes because you have not gone to vote. And and I think in the last elections, about 7 million Biden voters just did not go to the polls.
Yeah.
And that's a major difference. 7 million Biden voters, if 4 million of them voted for Kamala Harris, then the result of the election would have been different. So we cannot really say that this is insignificant in terms of the political structures or the political future of the United States. You don't vote, then you allow the Trumpist vision to prevail with its Supreme Court, with its institutions that are caving in, and an executive that is so overbearing and overwhelming that everybody basically shuts up. But the choice of the big corporate capital, which was most important in the way Nazi Germany became Nazi Germany, cannot really be dismissed as if it was not part of
Okay,
our
so I take your point. Let me just.
Lasch has always been very careful.
Right. So let's bring. Hold on. Wait. Let me bring Lasch back in. So
Lasch was there.
So Sol is saying that one of the problems with America are large corporations, maybe capitalism. We could probably fall back on some sort of critique, even a Marxist critique of capitalism. David, you're no necessarily friend of capitalism, but your critique of Lasch is that he's against progress, against the future, fantasizes nostalgia, fetishizes the past. Are you suggesting that Lasch might have been, or progressives need to be a little more sympathetic to not just to the future, but to capitalism itself, to the market?
Well, first, in response to Soli, that's a crucial point, and I really appreciate him making it, because we can get lost in these cultural weeds dealing with all kinds of abstractions and speculations. But the way in which, and this is where we would all join hands with Lasch and sing some kind of hymn, but the way in which corporate capital has marched through our political and legal system, poisoning everything in the process, is catastrophic, and it's really immeasurable. And if we look at the Trump administration, the right-wing Supreme Court, the media that pollutes discourse, gerrymandering, voter suppression, what all of these things have in common is they share major corporate sponsorship. So that's a critical point for anyone on the left and anyone who cares about democracy to track and consider. Now, to your point, Andrew, I'm not a Marxist. I believe in a free market economy.
Yeah, let me just jump back in. You say this stuff, but there needs to be a response. I mean, these large corporations, let me just respond, because some of this is just so annoying. these large corporations advertise, of course they advertise on Fox, blah, 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 but they also advertise on MSNBC, on CNN, in the New York Times, in the Washington Post. They advertise on shows like this, which are progressive, where there's no sympathy in any way with Trumpist populism. So this idea of falling back on these Marxist stereotypes of all corporations being reactionary and intent on racism.
No, Andrew, you do not have the liberty of putting words in our mouths.
Right.
That is not what we said. What I said personally, I cannot speak for David, is that a lot of corporations and their leaders, after having disowned Trump for a whole variety of reasons, most important of which for the technocrats was that they were going to be regulated, and maybe for Wall Street because they were going to be taxed or whatever it was that they did not like about Biden economics. They chose to go with Trump, assuming or hoping or expecting that what he said on the campaign trail was not going to be delivered in whole. And the thing is, it is being delivered in whole. And that the Trumpist movement was much larger than just rejection of Biden and Bidenomics or the Democrats, but it was truly a it was aiming at a fundamental restructuring of the American Republic. So this is not really bad corporations, good corporations stuff. This is a choice has been made, assuming or expecting something, but at the end of the day, probably a lot of them are not getting what they thought they were going to get, and they're getting something much, much more different. And that also has to do with the new economy that is being structured. If the technology companies are going to be the spearheads of the new capitalism around the world, or certainly in this United States, their preferences are very different from the preferences of corporations 20 years ago, because it's a different type of political economy. You've got to take that political economy context into account, in my judgment.
David?
Yeah. Soli summarized the position very well, but what I would add to that is it's not about the individual values of those who work within corporate America on the top rungs of the ladder. I mean, maybe Jamie Dimon personally makes donations to the Sierra Club. Maybe he's very concerned about climate change, but JP Morgan Chase is still heavily invested in extractive technology, which contributes to the problem. And that's because if Dimon said, you know what, we're going to become a green company and we're going to end all of those investments that are paying dividends for us, the board would kick him out and put somebody else in. So these corporations have interests and incentives. And what Soli is describing quite well is that they determined wrongly that their interest and incentives were better served by Trump than Kamala Harris. So
I take you, but let's end with a return to Lasch. When Soli came out with his piece, there was another really interesting piece in the New York Times on Lasch. 30 years ago, this book saw the coming backlash against elites, which really shares a lot of Soli's interest in Lasch. And it talks about the Hudson Yards as an example of the kind of luxury in New York, of all places, where the betrayal, I guess, of the American elites is most manifest. And of course, New York is a state and a city which is strongly Democrat. Let's go back to, let's end, Soli and David, with something about the American elite. So whether or not Lasch was completely right or not, he put his finger on something important, that the American elites have lost the responsibility for government and for looking after the country. Is the New York Times piece on Hudson Yards and the kind of luxury that exists now on the coasts, is that manifestation of that? David, we might begin with you. I think Soli's disappeared.
Oh, well, I would say is I am not a Marxist. This was I was going to say earlier. when you accused me quite hurtfully, Andrew, of parroting Marxist cliches. I'm not a Marxist. I believe in a free market economy, and I believe in it because it generates wealth. It does often create progress, and it leads to a certain cultural dynamism that central planning can't ever create. However, the free market economy needs regulation, and it needs balance with a social compact. And what we've seen in the past, 40 years is the erosion of that social compact. So there I would agree with Lasch, but where I would differ with Lasch is that I would say voters and consumers are also directly responsible for that erosion. Yeah. That there's a certain entertainment ethos that has infected our society, and it's made people more individualistic, more superficial, more frivolous. And in that regard, someone like Neil Postman is a prophet of the Trump age in a way that Lasch is not.
Yeah, and you've written, David, you've written very intelligently about David Foster Wallace as a kind of,
yes, and he as well,
in some ways, an inheritor of that Postman tradition. But Soli, we're still left with the idea of how to rebuild the progressive coalition in the 21st century, which I think is what Lasch was interested in. So how are we supposed to do that? David, you might have a shot at that. Soli keeps on popping in and out, I think.
Well, that's the eternal question, because, FDR was able to build the coalition, but then much later, no,
go ahead, David. Go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, but much later, Barack Obama built a multiracial winning coalition that and he was very much inspired by Jesse Jackson's primary runs to do that, which is something I detail in my book about Jackson. But everybody thought the Obama coalition was the future of politics, and the Republican Party had their autopsy. How did we die? How do we come back? But that didn't hold. And I think one of the reasons it didn't hold is because of the fracturing of, this is something where Andrew could help us out, the cult of the amateur, the fracturing of the attention span, people losing a sense of what politics should deliver, and becoming increasingly susceptible to various forms of propaganda. I don't know how to solve it. I'm just trying.
But don't we need to learn? I mean, last week we had Osita Nwanevu on the show. His new book is having a lot of impact. The Right of the People, Democracy and the Case for a New American Founding. He's come up with some very radical ideas for reestablishing a progressive majority in America. What's your take, Soli, on how we can point out all the problems from cultural to economic to political till the cows come home? But the challenge is to reestablish some sort of political coalition which can take on Trump and Trumpism. And perhaps finally, what wisdom would Christopher Lasch, we know the problems with Lasch, but what wisdom does he bring us?
I look, first of all, I mean, any great writer, in fact, there is this wonderful piece by Lasch. He quotes Arendt on Marx, and he says, anybody who's written so much and has such a good body of work necessarily contradicts itself, okay? Something along those lines. So Lasch has really a great body of work, and if there are contradictions or there are missing points, that's understandable. That does not diminish his importance, as far as I'm concerned, all right? Now, I end my piece with the headline or the heading of a chapter of his last book, that is, does democracy deserve to survive? Okay. And I think Lasch's response is that, one, you've got to have a proper assessment of why democracy ought to be important for ordinary people. And his answer is, you've got to be delivering something that is positive to them. That's number one. And second, and that may really be the problem, and I see this in the Mamdani case in New York. Look at the Democratic leadership's response to Mamdani. From looking from 5,000 or 9,000 miles away, I find it to be curious, to be polite about it. And the thing is, you've got to be able to touch, you've got to be able to communicate with the people who are actually going to be voting, whose support you are demanding. And that will start, whether or not we like it, by promising them something much better than what they have today. So, and it starts with equality. I don't think democratic systems can really afford to have that degree of inequality. And so inequality is the single most critical point on which you've got to actually construct your politics. I don't see this as from where I'm sitting being done by the Democratic Party. Okay, and that is something that Lasch would point at and would criticize them for. And then and then the other thing is, don't be condescending about others because of you believe your cultural values or your principles are superior to theirs. Try to be able to find ways of coexisting. All right, and that really requires a different perspective. And I might add, David, I really think the 60s. I mean, I was a child in the 60s, but I admired it and all that. The individualism of that period ended up with the selfishness of the 80s. I mean, for that, I take the movie Big Chill as my, if you will, perspective. And I think that is something that we need to be talking about, and then maybe go to an individualism which has social responsibility as part of its existence, and then apply that to your politics, which I see happening in some of the American states. And whether or not people are willing to listen to that kind of message remains to be seen. But if they don't, the American Republic is going to be a very different republic than when I first encountered it in 1977.
Final with David. Soli mentioned Mamdani. I think he's referring to him sympathetically. How does Mamdani fit in, and his popularity in New York fit in with Lasch? Is Mamdani against progress? Is he a nostalgic American like Lasch, or does he offer a more progressive vision and yet also an egalitarian vision of the American future?
You're asking me or Soli?
You.
No
question.
You have the last word.
I would have to study Mamdani further to answer that.
Well, your sense, and maybe, Soli, you can jump in here too. I mean, is someone like Mamdani, in terms of your disagreements on Lasch, is he the solution or the problem?
David?
Oh yeah, me again. I don't think that Mamdani. A couple things to keep in mind about him. First of all, he won a primary narrowly, in which only 25 to 30% of registered voters bothered to show up, and his opponent was a scandal-plagued buffoon. So I think that the left and the right are both having bizarrely overly dramatic reactions to Mamdani. I mean, the current cover of In These Times, which is a left magazine out of Chicago, has Mamdani gazing into the sky, and it says he brings us the light or something like that. You would think it was a Christian tract, outside the subway stop. And then the right is saying that he's going to destroy our civilization. Bill O'Reilly rants about it every night. So I would say that Mamdani is kind of a desperation and an extremity that's now unfortunately part of our discourse. Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous play of his No Exit, the takeaway is hell is other people. I think one of the problems now is we're all overly exposed to each other, and therefore we dislike each other more. We need to spend more time away from each other. But what I would
well, that's a good opportunity, Tim. When you bring up Sartre, it's probably time to end the show. Finally, Soli, very briefly, what would Lasch say about Mandami or his type of reaction to post-industrial capitalism?
One, New York is New York, and New York is not the rest. The New York City is not the rest of America. So let's just be clear on that. Secondly, the New York Times just published his main advisors, the three of his main advisors. It's a rainbow coalition. But at the end of the day, David, this is a man who promised free bus rides and childcare to people who need it. Mm-hmm. So this is really not, I mean, this is so big. Where I come from, this is basic politics.
Right.
This is what you do to your constituents who really cannot afford the basic things in life. So what he did to me, I mean, I'm not talking about the anti-Semitism part or the Palestine part, and leave those aside. The guy got votes from every single district in New York City. The fact that in the primaries only a quarter of the electorate voted is not really a surprise. I don't believe in primaries a lot of people vote as well.
Yeah, that's generally
that is not really an argument.
Fair point.
So he basically said in an environment and in a city where inequality is taken for granted, he said, I want an egalitarian system. I promise you an egalitarian system. Whether he can deliver it or not, I don't know. And on that particular score, I think Lasch would be a supporter of him.
Well, that's a final comment. Wonderful conversation, passionate, frank, and very controversial. The most important question of all of the future of progressivism in America. We haven't solved it, but we've addressed some of the issues. David Masciotra, Soli Ozel, real pleasure, honor. We'll do this again in the not too distant future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David and Andrew. Bye.
Thank you to you both. I really enjoyed it.